Welcome to today's webinar, HR Audits Focus Areas for 2022 and Strategies to Minimize Risk. I'm Anna Hobson from HR Simple, and I will be moderating today. Today's presenter is Laura from Constangy. The presentation will be about an hour long, and if you have any questions, please submit them into the question box, and I will go ahead and forward those. If you need more HR resources or would like to watch more webinars, please go to hrsimple.com/events. And you can also go to youtube.com/HRSimple to view past webinars. HR Simple provides federal and state-specific manuals. We make employment law easy. Our books are written by top labor attorneys, and we work with top firms such as Constangy to author our manuals. Vacation policies, employee documentation, and HR audits are just a few of the topics that the manuals cover. So before we get started, I just wanted to learn a little bit more about Laura. She's an experienced trial lawyer and client advocate. Her extensive career has involved representing companies of all sizes across many industries in all aspects of employment law. Laura has successfully defended clients in the courtroom before administrative agencies and on appeal. In addition to litigation, Laura has spent her 2+ decades of experience partnering with clients to counsel them through complex issues involving discrimination, retaliation, accommodation, and wage and hour compliance. Laura has also developed a passion for guiding clients through high-stake matters involving pay equity, harassment, leave of absence, and accommodations. Laura is an accomplished speaker and presenter, having presented on cutting-edge employment law topics at local and national events, as well as many online forums. Laura is board certified by the Texas Board of Legal Specialization. So on that note, I am going to go ahead and pass things over to her so we can get started. Looks great.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much, and hello everyone. Happy Tuesday afternoon. My name is Laura DeLeon, and as mentioned, I'm going to be talking to you today about HR audits and focus aspects for us, or focus areas for to minimize risk going into the new year. Figure this is always a good time while people are goal setting and setting their New Year's resolutions to think through some areas where we as HR professionals can work with our organization to reduce risk, to improve operations all around. And so this is a good time to do that. So I'm going to talk through a number of different topics today, but they're all sort of geared in mind with what are some proactive steps that HR can do in the organization to help aid compliance, help improve operations, and move things better. There's my contact information, and in case you're wondering who the voice belongs to, that is me. So, a lot of employment law, we talk about litigation, but we're also talking about litigation avoidance. And when we talk about lawsuits, we need to realize that there are some things that we can control in connection with the lawsuits, and there are some things we absolutely cannot control. We cannot control, for example, how an employee is going to feel about an employment decision or what their perception of the work environment is. But there are factors that we can control, and those factors relate to those policies and processes that we have in place as employers to ensure that our employees are treated in a fair and equitable manner, and that our decisions are sound, and that we have all the things in place that we need to if the time comes to defend a lawsuit. We can't choose who's going to sue us or who's not going to sue us, but we can try to put up our best defense to that. And so having these sorts of policies and processes are, the first and most important step to litigation avoidance and litigation defense. But litigation is not the only reason why HR might want to address an audit, and I would actually suggest that it's really better if you try to look at issues in your organization before they become issues in your organization. So don't wait for a lawsuit to strike before you decide that you need to revise your handbook or reevaluate your a certain policy or process. We want to be proactive on that. So, in addition to litigation avoidance, there's a lot of strategic reasons why we'd want to do an audit. And some of those might resonate more with the business leaders who you're going to be reaching out to support you conducting an audit. You know, they improve operations, they help better strategically align the organization, you know, and a lot of times just looking at a process that hasn't been looked at in a while, you're just overall going to look at a better way to you know, to organize or run a particular matter, which will lead to greater employee satisfaction and maybe even additional efficiencies gained in how you're doing that. So doing audits can be a pretty daunting task. I think the fish in a barrel picture is a pretty apt. It can be like shooting fish in a barrel. You know, where do I start? There are so many work streams within human resources that we can tackle with an audit, you know, from job posting to interviewing to onboarding to discipline, termination, leaves of absence, and just kind of goes on and on. It can be very daunting and overwhelming. But I think there are a few key areas that we can look at, tend to be more hot topic areas where we're seeing some particular focus on from the legislature or the courts or the EEOC, for example, or you could look at an area that you just particularly know as an organization you're pretty vulnerable at, and it's been a while, so it's time to look at that. A couple of common ones fall under the wage and hour category, and by that we mean, how do we pay our employees? Are they hourly, you know, non-exempt hourly? Are they exempt salaried? So those types of laws. So that's the Fair Labor Standards Act on a federal level. And I should say, those of you who operate, you know, in multiple states, you might find that there are some state laws that are more restrictive or more worrisome to the organization. You might choose you want to focus on those, and certainly I can name some examples of those. But for purposes of this, I'm going to really just focus on federal law. We don't want to get too far in the weeds with all the different state law nuances, but you can easily apply some of this information to particular state law or stateside type of audits. So wage and hour continues to be a huge, huge fertile ground for plaintiffs' attorneys. It has been for years and years. We saw a little bit of a dip in cases during COVID for lawsuits, particularly collective action lawsuits, which are they're a version of a class action, but it's when one or a couple employees bring suit on behalf of a broader group of employees. The FLSA claims are particularly ripe for that sort of treatment. Like I said, we saw a little bit of a dip last year in terms of those cases filed, but you know, we're seeing the momentum pick back up. Plaintiffs, lawyers, employee rights attorneys love the FLSA. One of the reasons is it is a very old and arcane law, and you can almost always find an issue with an employer's attempts to comply with the FLSA. And the FLSA is the law that covers exemptions, requires that you pay employees overtime, requires that you pay employees for certain types of you know, work performed. I mean, you always have to pay them for work that they do, but what time off the clock should be compensated as work time, such as putting on protective gear, taking off protective gear, waiting in line to pass through security, you know, time that's not work, but is under the employer's control. So there are a lot of fertile areas for plaintiffs' attorneys to sue under this area. And the other benefit of it is the amount of dollars that can be garnered when you have one employee versus bringing a case on behalf of 300 employees. The dollar amounts add up very quickly. If you think an FLSA claim, for example, it can go back 2 to 3 years from the date of filing. That's 2 to 3 years of issues times the number of work weeks in those 2 to 3 years times the number of employees that you had. You know, even if you are liable or your error is $3 to $4 an employee, you can see how that calculation quickly gets you up into lots of money. And then they get attorney's fees on top of it. So otherwise, small violations can definitely be aggregated to equal big dollars. And so that's why we see a lot of focus on these issues from plaintiffs' attorneys. a lot of the lawsuits, common lawsuit targets that you can audit to help you reduce your exposure. So being proactive on this. One is look at your exemptions. Do you have your employees classified correctly as being a salaried exempt employee or an hourly non-exempt employee? A lot of jobs are probably captured correctly. You know, we've got a number of different exemptions under federal law: executive, professional, administrative. There's a highly paid professional exemption. There are outside sales exemptions, but there are usually, in every organization that I have seen, a couple of jobs where it is an absolute gray area, and they often get captured or categorized as exempt when really they should be non-exempt. And over time, we tend not to pay attention to how we classify jobs. We might just keep adding jobs to our organization, and we're not really paying attention to how they are being classified and whether they're being classified properly. So if you haven't looked at this in a while, it definitely bears looking at, if not every job, well, then certainly those jobs that would be sort of in the middle gray area, kind of your middle management, upper level individual contributor. Those are the types of jobs that tend to be misclassified for various reasons. So that should be number one on your list, because if you misclassify an employee as exempt from overtime, but they really should be counted as non-exempt, then there are claims there for unpaid wages, unpaid overtime. Maybe you weren't handling your meal period deductions properly, potential for off-the-clock work that wasn't captured, that individual pay should be owed for. So that is one area that is like the building block or the foundation step for FLSA issues. So that's definitely something you want to look at. Another area is this off-the-clock work, and I know that is very difficult because if it's not on the clock, how do we know about it? But that is something that can be looked at by comparing the amount that employees clock in or out, and they actually get paid for. A lot of this work is automated now, but some of it involves manual adjustments as well. And usually we have, in lawsuits where this arises up, employees just sort of voluntarily offer, well, I did it off the clock because I didn't want to, get in trouble for working that time. So not just looking at, are your systems accurately capturing the time that is worked, but are your policies clear and well communicated to employees that they know that it is not proper to work off the clock. Mind you, you would still have to pay them for off-the-clock work, but you have a better arrow in your quiver if you can say, we don't allow this. We know we have to pay you, but now you're being disciplined because you didn't follow our timekeeping policy. So shoring up that policy and ensuring that your data, your payroll from your timekeeping to your payroll, that is accurate. Another thing I want to kind of point out about off the clock work a little bit is just this notion of, I just want folks to be mindful of rounding issues. You are still allowed to round your time cards up or down based on this archaic notion that it's very difficult to capture time to a T. Nowadays we have computers, we have electronics, we can tell you to the second about when an employee comes in. And so rounding policies, while still legal, and the courts still will still enforce them, particularly if on average it doesn't work to the detriment of the employee, it still is an example of a practice that do you really need. So that's something to look at while you're looking at your time systems. The other issue is overtime calculations. I know a lot of organizations outsource their payroll, outsource the computation of how overtime is exactly calculated, and we just assume that it's being done correctly. And I think that's I would encourage you not to make that assumption and periodically look and make sure that your payroll is being calculated correctly, that things are being coded to the right category. There have known to be errors in how that is all calculated. And a lot of times those payroll organizations are not going to accept legal responsibility for those errors. It is on you as the employer to make sure you're doing that right. So audit it, make sure that that's being handled correctly. The other issue with overtime calculations is, overtime needs to be paid at 1.5 times the employee's regular rate of pay for all hours worked over 40 in a work week. And you think, well, that's easy. Joe works makes $15 an hour, and so, $22.50 is his overtime rate. That is true. However, if you have or you offer non-discretionary bonuses or make other non-discretionary payments to employees, for work done, all of that additional money needs to be rolled back into the regular rate of pay and included in the regular rate of pay for overtime purposes. And we see oftentimes either employers omitting certain bonuses from the regular rate of pay, which means their overtime rate is too low, or we just see that it's not being calculated correctly. There's just something in the logarithm that's not working. And when we go back to do a true-up calculation, maybe we're using the wrong time frame, but the math isn't working out correctly. And that's an area of exposure. So when you're looking at that, pay attention to how are you incorporating non-discretionary bonuses into your regular rate of pay and ensuring that you actually are paying your employees overtime based on those amounts. Very important thing. The last topic for wage and hour that I want to talk about involves equal pay. And this can be a whole topic of a whole other webinar on conducting pay equity audits. Pay equity or equal pay is this notion that men and women should be paid the same for doing substantially similar work. That is the Equal Pay Act. It falls under the FLSA on the federal level. There are also a number of other federal and state laws out there that impact this. But one thing we do know is, particularly since the Me Too movement originated officially, on social media, I'm sure it existed before, but really came out with a splash several years ago. Since then, equal pay has been an increasingly, it's a bigger priority for the EEOC and the Department of Labor. They are conducting audits. They are exploring charges of discrimination and bringing cases against employers for equal pay violations. And in fact, just yesterday, I think the chairwoman of the EEOC, Victoria Lipnick, gave an interview with Bloomberg Law where she said, absolutely, equal pay cases are part of our priority again this year. We will absolutely be looking at employers and how they're paying their employees. Employers need to be doing audits and looking at their organization and taking steps to address these issues. And I would say, too, those audits really should be privileged under the attorney-client privilege, although we know the EEOC is going to try to argue that they're not privileged so they can see how the sausage is made in terms of compensation and the analysis. But equal pay is a very big priority. If you have not done a pay audit in the last couple of years, no matter what size organization you are, you really should take a look at that, whether do it organization, enterprise-wide, or focus on a particular business unit. You should not be sticking your head in the sand when it comes to pay equity. So I would bump that up there as a significant endeavor for a lot of reasons, not just the legal exposure, but also there's a lot of discussion socially about it. A lot of employers want to come out as being an equal pay sort of place to be. So it's a very good idea to do that. Now, to do that, and we're not going to go in today on the ins and outs of how to conduct an equal pay audit. That is an entire session on its own. But in terms of finding out areas in your organization that you can change now, you can make positive change now by addressing any statistically significant pay gaps. Do it now before you're facing a charge or facing a lawsuit, or if the EEOC comes back around next year and issues, reissues the the compensation collection on their annual reports, you have your house in order, you know where things stand. So that is a very important thing, equal pay audits that you should be considering going into 2022. The next sort of topic for audit, we've talked about paying employees, right? So let's kind of take a step back and talk about our application and our hiring process. If, a lot of people are hiring now. I think pretty much everyone is hurting for people. It is a really good time to step back and ensure your application and hiring processes are up to snuff. There are a number of laws that govern the application and hiring process. I mean, obviously, if you're a federal contractor, you need to be doing your analysis on your postings and your applications and your ultimate hires for your AAP. Even if you do that, and even if you're not already doing that, it is a very good time to look at your entire structure and how are we promoting our jobs? How are we casting a wide net? How are we bringing people through? Amazingly enough, a topic such as job applications is an area just that continues to be often overlooked, and we have oftentimes find issues on applications. And think about this, you're using this as a screening tool for employees. If your application process is faltering at some level, you're not going to be able to get good employees into the organization. But job applications, in addition to being one of the first things potential new hires see, is their data collection tool. And there are a number of questions and areas that you are not allowed to inquire into under our anti-discrimination laws. So for example, under Title VII, we are not prohibited to obviously make any hiring decision based on gender, race, color, religion, national origin. Under the Age Discrimination Act, we are not allowed to make an employment decision based on age. Under the Disability Act, Americans with Disabilities Act, we are not allowed to make an employment decision based on disability. Plus, we are limited in the types of medical related questions that we can ask, depending on where we are in the process. And you would be surprised at how many times we still see, no questions on job applications. Even 2021, we still see applications that ask for a candidate's age, for example, like what is your date of birth? You don't need that information. Now, granted, you'll say, oh, so what? It's not like we're going to use it. It's not that easy. If you're asking for it on an application, the presumption is that you're using it as a factor in your employment decision. So someone who's not selected can say, oh, I wasn't hired because of my age. And look, they asked for my age at the outset. So take a look at your applications. We don't look at those very often. They're one of those forms that are done and then put on a shelf, right, for a while. So look at your job application. Don't ask for date of birth. Don't ask for someone's marital status. Don't ask for someone's gender on there. You don't need that information at the application stage of selecting someone. So take it out completely. Don't ask about, I know there are a number of questions about, medical, we're concerned about, does this job, can the employee do this job? Well, you're allowed to ask questions after you've issued a conditional offer of employment. But on your application, you could ask a question like, this job requires lifting over 50 pounds. Are you able to perform the essential functions of this job with or without accommodations? Not list your workers' compensation injuries that you've had or list any prior injuries you had. That has no place on a job application, and I still see that to this day on some job applications. Another question or field that does not need to be there is the date of high school graduation. And you might think, why? What's the big deal? Well, you can easily do the math on a high school graduation date and assume someone was 18 years old when they graduated high school and then determine their age from that. So it has been found or is considered by the EEOC to be a proxy for age. So don't ask it. You don't need to know it. If you're doing an educational background check later on, you'll get the dates then, and and you can confirm its existence at that later stage. You don't need to know that at the outset. You can ask if you've graduated from high school, and you can ask how much college they've attended, but the years are not important at this stage. You also want to check your applications for local law compliance. A number of states do have kind of peculiarities that you can or cannot ask at the applicant stage, or they might want you to give notices of certain types of rights that they might have. And as some employers have kind of state addendums rather than having a different application for each state. You don't want to, you just have certain state addendums, but pay attention to your state laws and see what they would require. One item that's not on here that I should have put on this slide is make sure that your job application no longer asks for salary history of your applicant. Usually in the job history section, we ask folks to list out their last job. Who was your manager? Why did you leave? How much did you make? That last part is almost uniformly prohibited. A lot of states prohibit that question from being asked. A lot of courts and the EEOC will consider that a proxy for an Equal Pay Act violation. And the idea is that women make less than men in a given job, and generally, I mean, this is a grave overstatement, but I mean it is. There's a pay gap in the United States, and by asking someone what their prior pay was, you are perpetuating the cycle of discrimination. If a female applies for a job and says, well, at my last job I made $40,000, you're going to think, okay, well, I can offer her $45,000 for the job and she'll be happy. But if a guy's like, oh, I made $50,000 at my job because he's a guy and made more money, and so you base your hiring pay off of his historical pay, you're going to just be offering him more than that, and that's propagating, like I said, continuing on the theme of pay discrimination. So a lot of courts are saying you cannot base your hiring pay, your starting pay decisions based on salary history, and a number of states have gone a step further and said you cannot even ask that information. So if you are operating in one of those states that has that law, and there are probably about 20 or so states and localities that have that ban on it now, you don't want to ask that question, just black it out. So example of local law compliance there. The last area in the application and hiring process is this ban the box notion, and that's the terminology given to the prohibitions on asking an applicant about their criminal history at the outset of employment on their application. Job applications typically have a section on them that ask, have you been convicted of a felony within the past 10 years, or convicted of a misdemeanor, or have you been arrested or on probation? Well, you're not allowed to ask about arrests first and foremost, but you were allowed to, and in some places you still can, at the pre-offer phase, ask about criminal history. And, the idea is that, hey, we're not going to, why waste our time on an applicant if they're just going to fail our criminal background check? We kind of want to know at the outset. Well, the issue is, and why a lot of states and localities have had ban the box, meaning you cannot ask those questions on the application. You need to wait until a conditional offer of employment has been made, was because it's kind of twofold. One is that statistically, we find that such questions have the impact on discriminating against people on the basis of race. African Americans and Latinx individuals tend to have, be pulled over more by the police, have higher conviction rates, etc. And so by having that as a bar at the outset, we are unintentionally having a disparate impact on these races. The other component of it is we're not this notion that, hey, people who have paid their debt to society deserve a second chance. You know, let's let them try to get employed and rehabilitate themselves and reintegrate in society. And if you're just going to forever penalize these people for having a criminal background, it just perpetuates the cycle, and you will see recidivism, et cetera, with that. So that's the logic behind the Ban the Box initiative. This is a state-by-state issue. So again, it's an area where you want to be very cognizant of the local law in your area and whether they ban the box in this, and you have to wait until a later time. So be very cautious about that. You don't want to ask impermissible questions, you know, at the outset for that. Another aspect of the application and hiring process that you would want to audit or take a look at with respect to your background checks is your FCRA process and documents. And so what that is the Fair Credit Reporting Act, as a federal law, does a lot of things in connection with employment. When you as an employer are getting a background check run, using a third party or third-party information to look into someone's background, whether it's their criminal background, you know, maybe for some jobs it could be a financial background, or you're talking and getting, you know, various different types of just data from other sources on your employees. You need to provide them, one, a notice that you're going to do this. You need to give them a notice of their rights under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which must be on a standalone document, can't have anything else on it. And that you also have very specific communications that are issued if something comes back on the background check that would disqualify the person from employment. You need to send them a pre-adverse action letter that tells them what happened, what was seen, and give them a chance to challenge it. So it's a very orchestrated event, and a lot of employers will you either do this in-house or you outsource it with your background check vendor, which is completely fine. However, with the payroll vendors, you need to stay on top of them and have their process reviewed. What does the notice look like? What does the acknowledgement look like? Because they have to give consent to do a background check. Does it have all the bells and whistles that are required either on a federal or state level? And what is their process for issuing these adverse, pre-adverse action and adverse action letters? You as the employer are on the hook. And it's not so bad now as the last couple of years. There's a very good Supreme Court case that came down that sort of put the clamp on the size of class actions in this area. But it's a gotcha area, basically, for plaintiff lawyers that could lead to big exposure for you. So check the work that your vendors are doing, or double check your compliance with that, with that process. Again, these are documents that tend to be, once we put them in place, we kind of don't look at them again for a while. So it's good to dust them off as part of your review of your application process and hiring process to ensure that they're the most up-to-date documents that we have available. The next one is, I-9 documentation. So this is another, the I-9 documentation, this is, a lot of people roll their eyes at this. It's a very painful process. It can be, but it is also an area that is very worthwhile to audit, particularly if you are in an industry that might be targeted by the government or a focus point for the government for undocumented workers. So the I-9 documentation, as you know, is the documents that we all have to, a form that we all have to fill out. We provide 2 forms of identification to confirm that we're eligible to work in the United States, okay? And it's a form that hasn't changed in a lot of years, and people fill them out, we sign off on them, we shove them in a cabinet with the other I-9 documentation, and we just never think of them from that point on. Except that the government can come on in and audit our I-9 forms to make sure that we are actually employing people who are legally authorized to work in the United States. And if something is amiss on those I-9 forms, then you can be subject to fines and penalties for that. So it is a very good idea to audit those documents every couple years, whether they maintain paper form or even electronically. One, go through them And first off, you get rid of the ones that you don't have to maintain anymore. If someone's no longer with you and you've passed the retention period, get rid of them. But do you have them on all your current employees? Sometimes, shockingly, we might not have one on someone, or it's partially filled out, especially if you have like remote workers who maybe didn't come into headquarters to go through regular orientation. They had to be filled out remotely. Maybe it's sitting on someone's desk somewhere and never got turned in. So make sure you have it on everybody. So that's number one. That's probably the easiest part of the process. The next one would be, well, let's look at some of them and are they completed correctly? Now, depending on the size of your organization and your bandwidth, some folks choose to look at all of them. Others do a random sampling of every 10th person. Whatever your process is, maybe you look at it as you can, but you want to look and make sure they're completed correctly. Is everything kind of filled out, every box filled out? Does the address match the address on the ID card? Things of that nature. If you make changes, you are allowed to make changes to the I-9 form to make it correct, to correct it. You just need to, we usually suggest that you make the changes in a different color pen and then initial and date the date that the change was made, to adequately capture the fact that it was changed, but at least it's changed and the data is on there as correct. That's a lot of times we see issues with that where they're not filled out correctly. And then the last category that you want to look at with respect to I-9 documentation are if you have employees who are with you on a work authorization of some sort that times out, like let's say an H-1B visa. Are you going back in and has it been updated and re-verified? Because it's not just one and done where you fill out the I-9 and you don't have to go back and look at it. If someone's only on a work authorization and the work authorization is only for a couple of years, did you go back and are you redoing the I-9 verification when that work authorization is up? And so going back and updating and recompleting the I-9 form, has that been done for that population? So it does take some diligence, certainly, and it's a form, it's not exciting, but it is very much an area that you don't want to overlook. So would strongly recommend that y'all take a look at your I-9 documentation too, when you're doing kind of a refresh of your application and hiring process. So a different topic, and trust me, I know I'm going through a lot of hot topics here. Don't get overwhelmed. We'll talk at the end about prioritizing, right? These are just to give you ideas of areas, not that you absolutely have to do all of them. Some of these might be not so pertinent to you or not such a burning issue for you because maybe you did that last year or you don't have issues in that area. So don't feel you have to do all of these to be an A student. But another topic or another kind of general area that can benefit from an audit involve leaves of absence and time away from work. Again, areas where maybe not a lot has changed structurally or process-wise since we first implemented a process. But with time, we get a little bit laxer with the process. Maybe we're not being as diligent as we should. So it definitely can benefit you to go back and audit key parts of these to make sure that the process is still working. Is there anything we can do to fine tune it? Are we making any legal gaps that need to be corrected? So the first one on here is paid sick leave. A couple of years ago, in the world before COVID, one of the things that we employment lawyers were sort of pulling our hair out over was just this proliferation of paid sick leave ordinances, either on the state or local level. It started with, it just has blown up all throughout the country, requiring employers to provide a certain amount of paid sick leave to their employees. And a lot of these laws have very technical accrual rules, carryover rules, usage rules, that sort of thing. Well, going back in and checking to see how is that going? Are we accruing properly? Is our process working in terms of employees taking their PSL, or is a lot of it going unused? Are we seeing any abuse in this area? Those are areas with paid sick leave that are pretty good to follow. If you have to have notices up, are you posting those notices? Are you including the right things about that information in your packet? So paid sick leave is a good area to look at. It has been a few years since we've had significant development in the area, which means we've probably gotten a little complacent on it. Another thing with leaves of absence, and this is likely with just your medical leaves of absence, FMLA or non-FMLA medical, look at your employee communications. How long has it been? If you have template letters, which you should, have in place by now, it's usually very helpful to have template letters acknowledging a request for a leave of absence, granting a leave of absence, granting an extension, denying, those sorts of things. But when is the last time you've really looked at those letters? Take a look at them. Look at what is your process for sending those out. Who's managing that process? And even if you outsource this to a third-party administrator, take a look at these communications. Are they still up to date? Is the tone right for how we want to convey these issues to our employees? Are we covering all of the topics that the law says we need to cover in these particular areas? Do we have the right attachments to these letters? I mean, FMLA letters have I say a gazillion, that's a little glib. There are several notices and attachments that you give out. You give out the notice of rights, you give out a blank medical certification form, you give out, some employers give out FAQs on the leave of absence process or attach their policy to it. Are those up to date? Are those the correct forms? If you use, for example, the Department of Labor's medical certification form template, are using the most up-to-date ones. They change those every so often, and often without a lot of fanfare. So make sure you're sending out the correct information, and use this as an opportunity as well to make sure the contacts that you have listed for those policies or those processes is correct. The last thing you want to do is have on a letter saying, hey, call Susie Q if you need more information. And Susie Q left the company 2 years ago. So it's a big dead end. It just looks bad to the employee, but if you are in litigation over denial of a leave of absence or some other failure to reinstate or retaliation under the FMLA, your documentation and communications are going to be heavily, heavily scrutinized. So, it's not the end of the world, certainly, but hey, why does it have to be wrong if we can add this to our to-do list and look at these communications and ensure that we're sending out the most up-to-date information to our employees? The other two topics on this slide deal more with preventing abuse of leaves of absence. Under the FMLA, employees can take intermittent leaves, meaning you're not taking leave in one big chunk of time. You're taking it in a couple of hours at a time, or maybe a week at a time, or a day at a time. They can be very difficult to monitor and to track. Well, you should absolutely be auditing your people on leave and looking at how long have they been out on leave? When was the last date that we sent something? Now, granted, this might be more of a critical issue if you are doing leaves of absence in-house, but still, it would still be important to look at with your vendor if you use a TPA, so you can ensure that the trains are running on time with respect to your leave of absence, right? I mean, the whole reason why you have an administrator or someone managing it is to help ensure that people are getting out on leave when they need to and that they're coming back when they're supposed to. But with intermittent leaves, are you keeping track of the intermittent time off? Are you decrementing that time from their leave bank, and are you doing it properly, and do we have documentation to support it? A lot of times it comes in and no one's looking at it. Or maybe there's been a change in your organization and the person who used to look at it isn't there anymore, and it's just sort of fallen by the wayside. Are your employee approvals up to date? Intermittent leave can be recertified. It can be recertified every 6 months. So go in the file and see, hey, when's the last time we got an update from this employee to certify their need for this leave? Maybe they don't need it anymore, and it could be a situation where they're taking advantage of it because everyone just knows they have this on file, but they don't have it on file anymore. So look at that. It also helps to look at those employees who are on what I call the lingering leaves, who are just kind of on leave and are out there. No one knows where they are, or how long they've been out, or when they're coming back. Really good leave of absence management has you knowing where your employees are, having a return to work date, and if that date comes and passes, you are following up with that employee to see when is the updated return to work date and can we accommodate that. There are a lot of organizations I see, and this happens, so it's not a fault thing, where there's someone who's just been out there. Well, reach back out, get that up to date so we know, are we bringing this employee back, or do we maybe need to think about other options for this person's employment? So look at your leaves of absence, especially if you have a lot of usage. Look at your leaves of absence and ensure that you're using all the checks and balances that you have at your disposal to clamp down on abuse. The next category, and I think this is my second to last one, involves an independent contractor audit. So there's a lot of, I don't think there's anything really pending now to change the independent contractor analysis, but this goes to how you classify employees or individuals who work for you. Are they employees or are they independent contractors? Employees we have on a W-2, we withhold taxes, we contribute to Social Security, the IRS knows about them ahead of time, and they're processed that way. Independent contractors are not. They're paid through a 1099 tax form. Taxes are not withheld from any of their pay. They're not contributing to Social Security, at least the employer is not making the employer deductions for various unemployment taxes and Social Security, et cetera. So they're treated differently from that perspective. There was about, I'm going to say maybe 15 years ago, a huge set of lawsuits about classification of employees. Companies were not classifying employees correctly. They were classifying them as independent contractors and thus depriving these individuals of stock options and benefits. The IRS was getting mad because you weren't doing all the employer withholdings that you were supposed to. And it led to a lot of monetary exposure, millions of dollars of exposure. So since then, we've really tried to keep a tighter lock on how are we classifying individuals as employees or independent contractors. It is a somewhat of a complicated test. And I know employers have various levels of sophistication on this. Some companies have no idea who's out there in their organization. If you're not an employee, we have no idea who you are, because maybe we let the local manager just bring people on to do things now and then, or we could be very sophisticated and we have a whole, either a third party who brings these people on, or we have a very robust review process, or at least we know where they are, but we kind of think we know where they are and we kind of think we're okay with how they are. This can be a very big undertaking, but think about this on how important it is to ensure that you are classifying your workers properly. You do not want the IRS jumping down your throat and auditing you and determining that you've misclassified workers and owe all of these taxes and all of these withholdings that you have not made for yourself or on behalf of the employee. That can be a very unforgiving situation to be in. And you certainly don't want to face a lawsuit by employees indicating that they were misclassified and didn't get benefits. So the IRS has criteria. And this is another area where some states' laws are different. They have different tests that they want you to follow. In California, for example, very different, called the ABC test, that they want you to follow when determining whether someone's an employee or independent contractor. But for the federal perspective, the IRS has guidelines out there that they follow. They generally look to things like how much control does the company have over the individual in terms of how they are doing their job on a day-to-day basis. What are the business aspects of the relationship? Does the individual work for multiple other organizations more of a freelance type of thing, or are they fully dedicated to us? And then, other types of relationship things, like, is there a contract? How long is the contract for? Is it something where they're accountable to us for hours worked versus a product at the end of the day? There's a lot of things to go through. First step for auditing is figure out who you're looking at, right? Where are all these independent contractors? And then asking questions about the relationship to look at the IRS criteria. Now, the slide mentions there's a form, SS8, for the IRS, Determination of Independent Contractor Status. Okay, that is a form the IRS put out that said, hey, if you don't know, fill out this form and we'll tell you what we think. You probably don't want to do that. However, the form and the questions on the form can be helpful to use during your analysis and your audit to help you decide those close cases. Is this person an independent contractor, or are they an employee? So, there's a lot of resources out there on how to do this, but this type of audit will pay dividends in the long run in terms of decreasing your exposure. A lot of business leaders do not like this type of audit because they lose the flexibility and what they perceive to be the cost savings of having an independent contractor as opposed to an employee. With employees, darn it, you got to pay them benefits and give them vacation, and I have headcount that I have to buy when I've got an interview. With an independent contractor, I just call it my best friend from high school and have him come in and do some work, and boom, look how easy it is. So if any of the areas that I've identified for audits, this is probably one of the ones that I see the most internal pushback on, because it is perceived very much not as reducing risk and improving operations, but sort of binding the hands of our business leaders and taking away their flexibility. However, it is, as I mentioned, a very big source of potential exposure and liability at very big dollars if we don't do this right, not just on a federal level, but also on a sub-state levels as well. So the last area I want to talk about before I wrap it up and look at some questions is just to urge you guys again, look at your handbooks and policies. Again, it's not sexy, it's not exciting, it's not cutting edge, but my gosh, when was the last time you've actually taken a look at your handbooks or your policies, your employment policies that you have up there? If they are written in typewriter font, they are too old, okay? They need to be reviewed. Things change, things can change year to year. Some states are very active with issuing new laws. And so it has to be an exercise that is done every year because the laws change and what you're required to tell your employees changes, and you want to be up to date with that. How handbooks and policies work out in litigation, they can either be your friend or your foe. They can provide a roadblock that demonstrates to a court and jury, not a roadblock, sorry, a roadmap that demonstrates to a court or a jury, these are the rules of the road. We have the rules of the road out there. Jimmy Bob did not follow the rules of the road, and therefore we terminated him. It can help you in that because juries like policies and they want to see companies follow their policies. It can work to your detriment, though, if you have an outdated policy. Let's say you haven't updated your investigation policy in 5 years. Well, what's really happened in 5 years with investigations? Nothing much, except maybe your people who do investigations. And trust me, if you terminate someone after doing an investigation and they sue you, and then you go to court saying, well, we did a great investigation, the first thing that person's lawyer is going to do is, well, show me your investigation policy. And did you follow it? Well, no, if you didn't follow it, you are going to look like there was something else going on in the termination of your employee. So it totally invalidates your decision, your employment decision with respect to that employee. Your new process may be heads and shoulders better than what was in the policy. I would say it doesn't matter. It's not going to matter as much as you would like it to, because the other side is going to argue they can't even follow their own policies and they expect my client to, what a ruse. So having this stuff up to date is very strong for you. So take a look. Like I said, it's not exciting, but it is a very good task for maybe some entry-level folks, or even with the help of someone more senior and with the help of legal counsel, because you want to make sure you're saying things the right way and have all the legal I's dotted and T's crossed. It's always good to have a fresh set of eyes on stuff too. I mean, how many times do you have multiple people read something and everyone picks out something different, right? So read it. Okay, I think I have made my case with you to review your handbooks and policies. But some policies to definitely keep in mind. Your EEO policy. Do you have the right protected classes in there? Those can change, especially if you are in certain locations. You know, some people just have the top 5 and then say any other status protected, you know, by law. Others like to list everything out. Some states require you to list them all out. So take a look at your EEO policy. Do you have a robust accommodation policy in there, or do you just have this one-liner saying, oh, we'll accommodate employees with disabilities? You really should have a more robust policy in there about encouraging people to come forward with requests for accommodation, and how are you going to handle those requests. Investigations I alluded to, timekeeping policies, you know, make sure that it's just correct. You know, leaves of absence, if you, FMLA has not changed significantly in the last couple of years, but if your policy is older than that, yeah, you should really update it. There have been some important changes in the last 3 or so years that you want to make sure are covered by your policy. Do they identify the correct person to go through, or the correct process to go to report issues or to request things? If your processes have changed, you need to account for that. Drug use and marijuana. Another big one, a lot of states are allowing medicinal marijuana, a lot of states are allowing recreational marijuana. How are you accounting for that in your drug policy? You might say it's no big deal, no different. That's fine. You should acknowledge that. Others might have to go through or have different language given the state that you're in. So that is another area where we have seen a lot of change recently, and our policies might not have kept up. And then, as I mentioned, do state law updates. So key takeaways, okay, don't feel like you have to boil the ocean. There is a lot of stuff here. Hopefully I've given you some food for thought of things that you can think of and areas you want to start tackling. But keep in mind, you can absolutely do this. You know you should do this. You know it's the right thing to do. You know that there are areas of risk in your organization. Identify the ones that are the biggest risk for your organization. You know, you can't do it all, so prioritize. Build out a roadmap. Huge component, though, is get buy-in from your superiors, from the business, especially if it's an audit that is going to have financial consequences, like we're going to need to invest in new software, we're going to need to hire new people, we're going to need to increase people's pay to alleviate this pay gap that we have and can't explain. Very important to get buy-in ahead of time before you embark on the audit, because you don't want to spend all your beautiful time doing an audit and then having the business say, yeah, thank you, but no thanks, and shove it in a drawer. So get buy-in, partner with them, have a plan and hold yourself to it, and definitely enlist help. A lot of these things are a cross-functional team is going to be needed to work on this. So involve all your stakeholders together and set out your plan and accomplish it. So thank you very much. I don't know if we have a little bit of time, Anna, to answer some questions.
Yes, there are a couple questions in the chat. The first one reads, we have our salary exempt employees complete a timesheet for tasks performed. If they only work a half day, do they use a half day vacation, or do they just have a half day on their timesheet? We have always paid their weekly salary, and if they are off a full day, they use vacation, and we have not made them use partial days of vacation, but not sure if that is correct.
So assuming they're not on like a leave of absence, okay, so generally with salaried employees, you cannot do a partial day deduction because that sort of flies in the face of a partial day deduction from pay, because that flies in the face of being a salaried employee. However, if they have vacation available or PTO available, they still get the full amount of pay. You're just taking out of that bucket. You can absolutely do that on a partial day basis. So in that instance, to answer your question, if they only work a half a day, you would dock them or attribute half a day of vacation to that time work. The main thing is you want to keep their salary the same. If they're out of vacation, you can't dock their pay. They get that. You just have to keep paying them their salary. But if they have that PTO or vacation, yes, you can decrement out of that bucket.
Our second question is, what is mandated for an HR audit yearly, quarterly, and semi-annually?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think anything is mandated. This is all best practice. Now, with some audits, I've seen them like every other year. Some things like policies, have been done yearly. Pay equity audits. Some organizations do them every 6 months around their pay planning cycle. Some do them every year. I would certainly say at least every year on pay equity, no longer than every 2 years, because things change so much. So a lot of it depends on, how big are you doing this, and are you doing the entire organization? That might not be practical to do it. So there's really no set time is the short answer to that question. Best practice, grade A student would be to audit, certain things at least every year.
Our third question is, if an employee changes their address, do we need to change that on the I-9 form?
That is a good question. I don't think you have to do that. It's really just correcting technical errors at the time. You're not updating them as everybody changes. It's just if something was missing from the original form, that is not in there. Now, if it's someone that you're re-verifying because they've gotten an updated work authorization form, then I would say, yes, you should take that opportunity to update their address, because that all of that information has changed at that time. And so you want to make sure that the information with the new work authorization is accurate.
And then our last question today is, where can I find these items on the web?
Well, so I guess there's a lot of different, and we'll make the slides available. I did reference the IRS guidelines. You can literally Google as your friend. You can just type in IRS independent contractor test, and it'll take you. I did it before I got on today to make sure that it's still there. You can definitely Google that. The DOL has a lot of good, Department of Labor has a lot of good resources with respect to the FMLA, and kind of have some really good employer guides and fact sheets that can help you stay on top and determine kind of what you need to have and to say. Also, you can use organizations like, present company organization included, that might have some checklists or other information to help you, help you on your way.
We did actually get one last question after that.
Sure.
It reads, in relation to leave of absence, if an employee goes on leave and does not return to the workplace, how do you move forward with termination?
Okay. So with that, and I'll keep it very high level because some of this can be very fact specific in terms of why are they out on a leave? Is it for their own medical condition? I'll assume it is, and not their own FMLA to take care of a sick parent, right? I would say you should communicate with them in writing to say, ask them to provide you with a return to work date, or if they need an extension on their leave, to provide you with information to allow you to assess that. If they don't respond to you, I like to give people a couple of chances because it just looks better as an employer to ensure that you've really tried to reach out to this person, email, send a letter, FedEx with a signature, or some other traceable means to ensure that they've gotten it. You send them a letter. If you haven't heard back, you reach out again, and you might say 2 or 3 times is enough, but ensure that your subsequent communication says, if we don't hear from you by this date, we are going to treat it as if you have resigned your employment, or you can say we're going to move forward to terminate your employment. If you think this is an error, please contact us. But you can do that if you don't hear back from them, okay? Just make sure that you can demonstrate that you have reached out, attempted to communicate with them, and you kind of have all of that documentation available. And then, the person's MIA, they're AWOL. You can definitely move to terminate them, but just want to make sure that you've done that reach out and have done that.
Alrighty, that's all of our questions for today.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, everyone. I appreciate your attention. I hope that you found this very useful. You're giving you some good ideas to take charge in the next year. So thank you very much.